But the other issue that Vivek mentioned was that he wants Trump to oppose the creation of a central bank for digital currency, which is a proposal that people inside the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve are pushing. Here is what Trump said after he spoke to Vivek about that issue.
And tonight I'm also making another promise to protect Americans from government tyranny. As your president, I will never allow the creation of a central bank digital currency. Do you know about that?
No, it's an interesting issue to raise in New Hampshire. New Hampshire tends to be a state that is opposed to government intrusion. It's a state that often values privacy. In fact, when I did the Snowden reporting, one of the very first major political figures who contacted me to express support for Edward Snowden was a former two-term Republican senator from New Hampshire named Gordon Humphrey, who wrote to me and said, look, as long as Snowden didn't leak information to the Russians, and I believe he didn't, I consider him a hero for having brought this information to the public. I asked whether or not I could tell Snowden that, whether or not I could publicize that, and he gave me the go-ahead. And it didn't surprise me that that came from New Hampshire. It has this kind of anti-government streak, so it's an interesting issue for Trump to invoke while campaigning in New Hampshire, and you saw the cheers there. But I think a lot of people are probably a little bit confused about what this issue is, what is a digital, a central bank for digital currency, what the implications are, why it's necessary to oppose it, who it is who's promoting it, and why. We've obviously spent a lot of time on this show reporting on things that I find very disturbing, like the increasing power to exclude people from the financial system as a result of the belief that they are dissidents or have a bad ideology. We saw in Canada the ability of the government to freeze people's bank accounts who participated in these nonviolent protests against COVID mandates. We spent a lot of time on this show talking about how a centralized digital economic system is putting hands into states in the West to control even more and to punish even more the prospect for dissent. And so we decided it was an important issue. It is an important issue, and I'm not an expert in central banks or digital currency, so we decided to ask somebody to come on who can help explain what Trump meant here and what this debate is all about. His name is Saifedean Ammous, who was a professor of economics at the Lebanese American University from 2009 to 2019. He holds a PhD in sustainable development from Columbia University, a master's in development management from the London School of Economics, and a bachelor in mechanical engineering from the American University of Beirut. And he is also the author of the book, The Bitcoin Standard, the decentralized alternative to central banking and the fiat standard. We spoke to him just a few minutes before we came on the air. I found this discussion incredibly illuminating about what this issue is, why it's important, what the implications are, and I think you will find it illuminating as well. Professor Ammous, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Glenn. I'm a huge fan.
Thank you. That's nice of you to say. So one of the reasons we're talking about this, in fact, the principal one, is because of comments made by former President Donald Trump at a campaign rally in New Hampshire on Wednesday, where he said, and I think it was kind of out of the blue, at least from the perspective of a lot of people, it's not something Trump discussed before, quote, "Tonight I am also making another promise to protect Americans from government tyranny. As your president, I will never allow the creation of a central bank digital currency." And he kind of made a comment immediately after, oh, have you heard about that? Do you know about that? Clearly a lot of people hadn't. So before we delve into the specifics, if you could just explain the controversy around this issue, who is exactly proposing this central bank for digital currency, and what are their arguments as for why we need that?
So it's been proposed by various economists, central banks, officials, people at the World Economic Forum. These kind of busybodies are generally marketing this as a great idea. If you wanted to really think about what it means practically, I think the best way to put it is that it is everything that you hate about the current monetary and political system that we have, but done much more efficiently. That's, I think, what summarizes it. Effectively, it would allow central banks to have almost complete control of the economy. It would allow them to censor transactions, to confiscate money much more efficiently and much more effectively than they are able to do it right now. And it would allow them to control monetary policy and fiscal policy also with a lot more efficiency. So if you don't like those things, you're going to love central bank digital currencies even more.
So one of the alternatives that has excited a lot of people who are very worried about state surveillance and the ability of the government to use control over our monetary system to enforce ideological orthodoxy and the like are things like Bitcoin and blockchain and other kinds of cryptocurrency. And for a long time, the argument was that if we introduce Bitcoin, if we allowed cryptocurrencies to flourish, it would enable people to engage in financial transactions anonymously. It would make it difficult, if not impossible, for the state to engage in the kind of digital surveillance that it loves to engage in, and it would essentially mean that we would be free from state monitoring in the way in which we spent our money. Is the creation of a central bank for digital currency relevant to the emergence of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies? In other words, would the creation of a central bank preclude the ability of these other cryptocurrencies to emerge and flourish?
I think it's related, but I don't think it is a competitor to Bitcoin. I think central bank digital currencies, people think of it as being something that would undermine Bitcoin, but I think it's going to be the best advertisement for Bitcoin. Because the value proposition of Bitcoin is not so much that it is digital, because your government's fiat currency is currently predominantly digital. Only a very tiny fraction of US dollars is printed into paper money. The vast majority exists as digital money. So the digital part of Bitcoin is not the important part. The important thing about Bitcoin is that it is censorship resistant, meaning that anybody can transact and nobody can kick you off the network. Anyone can join the network, and that its monetary policy is predictable, algorithmic, and it's set in stone and nobody can change it. So Bitcoin precludes governments being able to manage monetary policy and from being able to censor transactions. And so what central bank digital currencies do, the value prop that is being advertised by people like the Bank for International Settlement, is precisely that it allows governments more censorship, more control, and more monetary policy supervision and more fiscal policy supervision. And that's exactly what Bitcoin can solve. And so I really think Bitcoin is the only alternative to this, because if you don't have Bitcoin, you're going to end up at the mercy of your government. I mean, we're already seeing this, and this is why we shouldn't put too much stock in Donald Trump's words, because this kind of central bank digital currency, it's not necessarily a massive transformation that's going to happen overnight. Gradually, we're seeing how the banking system is being weaponized to crush political dissent. And of course, monetary policy has always been highly political. And these things are just going to continue. And it's not easy for a president to switch these things off, even if he wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, that was really the question that I had. Once you separate it from Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, which could continue to exist and to be developed even with this central bank of a digital currency, what really would this central bank that Trump is vowing to oppose, what really would it enable the government to do that it can't already do? As you said, it's almost like archaic at this point to even think about the dollar as being a paper currency. Very few people spend money through paper. We spend it digitally with credit cards or bank transfers, everything relating to a central bank. Seems like the government has a huge amount of power right now to monitor what it is that we're doing. We've seen candidates like the Canadian government and others start to use exclusion from the financial system or freezing of bank accounts as punishment for political protests and activities that they disapprove of. So what really would the creation of this central digital bank enable the government to do that it can't already do more or less now?
I think the simple answer to that is that it would take out the commercial banks from the equation and just make it far more efficient and faster for governments to exert their control. I think the best analogy, or the best closest thing that we've seen to central bank digital currencies, is the Gosbank of the Soviet Union, where there was one central bank for the whole country and everybody had an account with the central bank. And that, of course, was very conducive for a kind of the kind of economic system that the Soviet Union had. Whereas Today, it's a little bit more complicated because you have to call individual banks, and you need to conduct this business through the commercial banks. So I think perhaps operationally the most significant aspect of this might be that it puts commercial banks out of business. This is one possibility because it makes their job obsolete, because governments can just give you a central bank digital currency, an online wallet, and then that makes your bank obsolete, and now you're banking directly with the Fed.
Interesting about this surveillance argument, when back in 2013 we were able to do the reporting from Edward Snowden's archive that he furnished to us that demonstrated how widespread and pervasive, really ubiquitous state surveillance had become over the internet. Most people were not only shocked by it, but also disturbed by it. There was a lot of public opinion in favor of that reporting, precisely because people understood why it's so threatening to allow the government to monitor everything we're saying, to monitor everything we're doing. I'm not going to say it didn't have some opposition. Certainly it did, especially in Washington. But a lot of people said, yeah, I think it is very disturbing. They could easily see why they wouldn't want the government being able to monitor the internet. When it comes to currency, it seems like for whatever reason, people suddenly lose the understanding of why privacy and why anonymity matter. And of course, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, the argument tends to become, well, look, if we allow financial transactions to be conducted anonymously, without government detection, without government monitoring, it will empower all the bad people, the people who traffic in drugs, the people who trade child pornography, the people who are laundering money, the people who are doing all sorts of illegal things, to be able to do it without detection. And therefore, we want the government being able to trace money, because if they can't, it means a lot of people are going to get away with a lot of crimes and other bad things. What is your answer to that?
I think if you really want to look at crime, the big leagues of crime, they don't use things like Bitcoin. That's not really very useful for them. They use things like JP Morgan and HSBC. That's where the real criminal activity goes, because these financial institutions, with the current monetary system, wherein they have an enormous amount of monopoly power, because the central bank has a monopoly. The central bank licensing of banks is a very limited process, which grants them a high degree of monopoly. And therefore, and also, these banks are able to effectively create money. Every time a bank makes a loan, it is creating new money and bringing it into existence. So that's ideal. If you wanted to perform serious criminal activity, you'd want to have one of these international banks that has the ability to create and destroy money across borders. And that's what we see. I mean, these major banks have paid billions of dollars in fines, and they've been implicated in all kinds of criminal activity. So it may be the drug dealer on the street who might be using digital currencies, but the big cartels are using the big, playing in the big leagues with the HSBC, basically, and these large banks. And I think ultimately it's the same argument with freedom of speech. Would you rather live in a society where one person gets to decide who gets to say what, or would you rather have the freedom of having everybody have the freedom to say what they want, and then people have the freedom to decide what they believe? And I of course, believe in the second option, and I think financially it's the same thing. I'm willing to accept the idea that unsavory types of people might be able to do transactions that I can't stop, because I know that the cost and the damage that would come from having a central authority being able to dictate who gets to do what kind of transaction is far more damaging and far more dangerous. And, look around over the last few months. I know you've been pretty outspoken about the genocide in Gaza. I'm Palestinian myself. I've been following this. I know thousands of people. I've heard about thousands of people in the US and Germany and other Israeli puppet states who have had their livelihoods destroyed because they've spoken out about this. And I think people like you should be really concerned about this. People like your audience as well. I presume your audience is generally probably about one standard deviation higher in terms of intelligence, conscientiousness, and ability to notice what's going on in the world. And this is not going to be popular. Moving forward, they're going to be mobilizing all kinds of censorship regimes. And with the way that it's going with financial assets, you don't really own anything unless you have Bitcoin. Everything that you have can be taken away from you pretty straightforwardly. So right now it's with banks, but with central bank digital currencies, it'll become even easier for them to confiscate all of those things. And even if you think you have hard assets, stocks, bonds, all of those things are going to become easier and easier to confiscate. And we're already seeing precedents being set with the confiscation of the reserves of Russia and confiscation of the property of Russian individuals in the West. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is expanded further and further to punish political dissent.
I'm glad you raised that example because I do think one of the inherent recognitions that we have, maybe as American citizens or people who grew up in countries where they're inculcated with the idea that we're supposed to be a free society, is the fact that there is a cost to every freedom. If you allow free speech, you're going to allow people to express views that might actually be harmful, that might contaminate other people in terms of their thinking, that might even lead them, induce them, encourage them to engage in violence. If you'll force the police to get a search warrant before entering homes, it's going to make it more difficult to catch some criminals. Some criminals will probably get away. These are generally costs we're willing to pay for the freedom because the alternative is so much worse. For whatever reason, when it comes to currency, people can't comprehend that same analysis that, if we don't allow the government to monitor every financial transaction, bad people are going to get away with things that they shouldn't get away with. But in terms of the political dissent issue, we have seen a huge escalation in the amount of censorship and all kinds of other forms of punishment for dissent, in particular in the war in Gaza, for support for anyone who's critical of what the Israeli government is doing. And that has meant that a lot of people who previously, for the last several years, have been very concerned about the various multi-pronged efforts in the West to punish dissent, a lot of those people who support Israel are now starting to be a little bit more open to the possibility that perhaps these are good things. So let's just focus on that for a second. One of the things that I have found most alarming in terms of these developments of ways to control thought and punish dissent is the increasing power that is being consolidated to exclude people from the financial system. PayPal now partners with the Anti-Defamation League and asks them to identify ideological extremists. Anyone the ADL says that's an ideological extremist can lose their account on PayPal. We've actually heard lots of reports now of people increasingly not being able to open bank accounts or stock trading accounts or brokerage accounts because of whatever people discover about their online expression. How concerned are you about this trend where people are not just being excluded from one payment system here or one payment system here, but increasingly from the entire financial system because of how digital and concentrated it is due to their political views?
Well, on a personal level, I'm not very concerned. I have Bitcoin, so that doesn't really concern me all that much. But I think from a societal perspective, I can see where this is going. And of course, it isn't just on the issue of Palestine; it's also on the issue of pharmaceutical products. If you talk bad things, if you say bad things online about certain pharmaceutical products, you also get your banking canceled. And I think, it's hilarious watching a lot of the many people who made their name as being freedom advocates over the last few years on the issue of health freedom turn into just your average raving lunatic when it comes to the issue of Palestine. But it's beyond just this hypocrisy in this one issue. I think there's a very important lesson here, which is that you don't get to choose how these things are going to be utilized. And so one day you might think, all right, well, this is good. It's taking out the bad guys. Well, one day you're going to be the bad guy. And with the way politics are, the way the politics are becoming more and more polarized in places like the US, I mean, it's becoming regular part of the political idea that we're going to go after our political enemies. We're seeing it right now between Democrats and Republicans. And so you can only imagine that this is going to exacerbate. And right now, maybe this is only being used against health freedom advocates and Palestinian freedom advocates. But very soon you could see this become much more widely used against much more common ideas in American society.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it with the Canadian trucker protest, and we've even seen it with people who, not even with COVID, but were just allegedly connected to right-wing views that were deemed too dangerous to allow people to participate. As the last question, let me ask. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.